Welcome back to another episode of the Hustle Nation podcast. Today we've got a real treat and a local Wisconsinite. Mr. Lucas Jadin is in the house. Keynote speaker, best-selling author, and I've got to mention the titles, Win in the Dark and the Twin Thieves, which I've got right here to my right arm. Mindset, leadership, and culture coach and co-founder at Jadin Jones. Lucas, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. Really grateful to be here.
Glad to have you.
Glad to have you. Yeah, we had your co-founder, Steve, on last year, Steve Jones. Most people know him, the famous football coach. And as we've kind of just continued to bring back more people, it's amazing how many great minds are out there. And after reading your book, I was reminded that we got to have Lucas on the show and get the other perspective of the Twin Thieves.
Well, terrific. And really grateful to be here. And when we look at the Twin Thieves, it's over and over again, we see it as the greatest barrier that holds back leaders to be their best. And what we're finding is it's not just in business, it's not just in sports, it's also at home. It's also personally, because when the fear of failure and the fear of judgment drive us, we hold back. We don't speak up. We don't take chances. And we really stifle the best version of us. So grateful to be here, and hopefully we can make this really valuable for everybody.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in. The first question I got to ask you, though, is your journey. So at Jadin Jones, you're currently working with big companies, big names, but it didn't start like that. So I'd be curious how you got into leadership in the first place and what that journey was like for you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's interesting. We get a lot of people that reach out that want to run a leadership business, and they see the things on social media, right? They see the keynotes, they see the big things. And what they didn't see was, I'll never forget, Steve and I got done with an event about 6 or 7 years ago. And we were talking about it. And I'm like, well, did you get paid for this? Because we weren't together yet officially. I'm like, did you get paid for this? And he's like, no. And he's like, I got a bag of chicken though. And so the reason I laughed, it was at like a local restaurant, and they offered a bag of chicken. And I'll tell you what, I was there to witness Steve, and then I spoke alongside of him. He crushed it. And it's very similar. Like, he brought the same energy, he brought the same enthusiasm as what he does today at a very much different financial return. But he started off being willing to do it for a bag of chicken. And I just think in that journey, I appreciate you asking it, because in any journey, whether it's building an insurance company, whether it is building a marketing agency, whatever it is, there's so much work in the dark that nobody sees. So for me, I'll keep it relatively short on my journey, but I grew up in Freedom, Wisconsin. I was the oldest of 2 other brothers and had an incredibly close family. Extended cousins were really close, and I was the oldest. And it was an honor to be the oldest. Also, maybe some pressures that went into that. And sports were my world. They were what I woke up in the morning, wanted to do, talked about at recess with my buddies. And then also after we got home from school, we would play with them. And so that's also where my opportunity became, because a lot of people would say my greatest strength was the mental side of it, whether it was basketball, distance running. I did a lot of distance running, but it was also my greatest challenge. And I can remember sometime in high school, really coming headfirst into some anxiety and not having the tools and the mental skills to handle it. And so it came at a high cost. The toughest moments of my life were those years. And I can remember laying in bed, just praying that I would get through it. And I can remember literally praying, saying, God, if you just help me to ease my mind so that I can get some rest. Because we all know what it feels like when you want to shut off your mind, but it just keeps going. That's where I was at. And I can remember praying, like, if you just help me to get through this, I'll do everything I can to pay it forward and help other people win this mental side so that they can be the best versions of themselves. And so through a lot of tough moments, but then also a lot of people that put their arms around me, skills that I searched to learn, I really scratched my own itch, for lack of better words. I was able to grow a business in this, and then join Steve to do this as well. And so today I get the opportunity to work with people at the highest levels, from hedge funds to professional coaches to business owners, to educational leaders. And every time I get the opportunity to do something like this, be on your podcast, to coach them, to do a keynote, I take it as an honor because I remember that little boy that was literally just praying to get through himself. And so it's a real honor to be able to give back and hopefully help other people along the way.
So, Lucas, I think you may have glazed over some things there, because as I look at your background on LinkedIn, you have a background in teaching, basketball camps. You also had trained to be clutch. Most people don't just come out of college or come out of their first job kind of being able to lead like that. So you must have had some kind of run-in with leadership in your teenage years where you said, I am really into this, because for a lot of people, even like Steve, it takes decades. It took me 40 years to get to the point where I really wanted to immerse myself in reading leadership books every single day. Where did that all start for you?
It's a great question. I can remember being 12 years old reading Vince Lombardi's Rules to Winning. Like that's different, right? Like I think that's just a little bit different because that's what lit me up. But I just remember loving to win. Like no matter what it was, I have a very competitive family. My mother ran for the Badgers cross country. My dad was in a lot of sports, and we love to compete. And then I was the oldest. And I think there are some things that just from a leader end landed on my shoulders, whether I wanted it to or not. But from that way forward, what I just started to find was if I wanted to win myself, and then for the teams that I coached, there was a big hole. And that hole was what's happening on the inside. So after I graduated college, I went into teaching. I was a middle school teacher for 4 years, and I coached. I coached girls basketball. Was one of the sports that I coached. And we had a really talented team. It was at Appleton North High School. We had a lot of kids that were phenomenal as freshmen. And the first year, we got beat out of the playoffs early. And when we looked at it, we were like, man, we got beat out by a team that we had already beat twice. What happened? And we all came back to, we came up short when it mattered most underneath the bright lights. But the quote that we really love is, you don't shine under the bright lights. The bright lights just reveal your work in the dark. And when we took a very clear analysis of how did we prepare for that moment, physically, we were great. But mentally, we didn't have a systematic way of training it, and we were exposed. So that work with those kids, teaching middle school kids every single day, day in and day out for 4 years. I know teaching financially may not be the most rewarding career, but as far as experience and honing a skill set, I tell people there's not a better career to go into. Because for me, before I did my first paid keynote, I probably had about 300 presentations under my belt, many of them to students that don't give a dang if you feel bad, if they roll their eyes at you when you're talking, or if they, fall asleep when you're talking. So I had to learn through those reps how to capture a room, how to engage a group. And so after 4 years of teaching, I left that full time to join Joshua Medcalf and work underneath him at Train to Be Clutch. And he was a role model for me in many ways, taught me many different things. And then after, I think it was about 3 or 4 years at being underneath him, I left to start my own thing with Steve. So that's the journey. And there were many mentors and models along the way.
Very cool.
It's interesting when Chris and I have talked a lot about leadership, just hearing your story. Leadership really started at such a young age for you, and it took a lot of different forms. And I think when people get into, when they see someone like yourself and like, all right, how did he learn this, and how does he coach this? Certainly part of it is experience, but the other thing that I've been really impressed with, with your two different books, is how you crystallized it into action, right? So it's really easy to talk about theory about, well, be a leader and, all the different traits that go along with that. But I feel like you've really been able to take these kind of complex things and make them very simple and actionable. And so like Win in the Dark is one in particular for me. Can you share a little bit about just how some of the kind of key points there and how you got to that point? Like what were things that kind of revealed those different pieces of the framework?
The best answer I can have to that is everything that you read in one of our books was already spoken hundreds, probably more like thousands of times. And so everything that's in our book is like the highlight version of what we've already seen light people up, whether it's in live events, whether it's on social media. But all of those concepts are the best that we already know they work, because believe me, we have many other things that we tried to teach that came on deaf ears or didn't come off well. But that's what I would say, how we got to that actionable nuggets. And both Steve and I, we made our career early in the lab, like actually doing as coaches, as teachers. And I think what the benefit of that was, they don't care what the theory is. They don't necessarily even care what the science says. They just want, does this actually help me to get better? And that's what we really, how we get a lot of the reps of, is this content solid? Is it consumable? And does it actually work? Is through the live real-time interactions.
I think having the background too, having been there and done that and utilized it and know that it works makes a big difference. But also teaching kids, I found too, is, I mean, it's nice to know that you've been there. Maybe you've won championships and you've had that winning pedigree. But I've also found too that once you demonstrate how much you care, then you can really gain their attention, and then they start paying attention. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword between having experience but also caring about those people. And I know that you and Steve talk about that a lot in the Twin Thieves.
Yeah, no doubt. We look at it. I just broke this down for a client today. Do you guys remember those pan balances back in the old classrooms, science rooms, where they have a scale on each side of them? And you put weights on one and it goes up and you got to balance it out. So for all leaders, we believe that there's a combination that you need to balance out. And one is the hustle. Shout out to y'all. One is the hustle. This is the push. This is the credibility of, do you have the ability to light up the people that you lead? But then the second one is, do you balance that with loving them up? Like, do you care for them so deeply that they're going to be open to you pushing them that hard? Because if you only push, you might be the smartest person in the world. And if you only push and show them where they come up short, you might be great. But what we see is people give up on you because they don't want to hear it after a while. But if you only care, but you don't push, then you're just a friend. And so the balance is, how can you raise the level of care, empathy, understanding without sacrificing the standard of what excellence looks like? And so for me, I was never going to run cross country. I played basketball, football, baseball, never was going to put on the short shorts and get out there and run. But I met a person that was the best at doing that like I've never met. His name was Thane Jones. He was my cross country coach. And as an 8th grader, he just told me, just come one time to one of our summer events. So I get there, kind of rolling my eyes like, really? Let's get this over with. But what he hit me with that day was some just absolute conviction that, number one, he was driven. He was passionate, and he knew how to push people to be better than they ever could be alone. And he also deeply cared about you. And what that does to people that we found is, it's almost like a magnet. People want more of that. And so he got me to do something I never would have done alone, which is put on those short shorts for the next 4 years and fall in love with the sport and work harder than probably anything I've ever done, because he did those two things really well.
Yeah, that's gold right there. To dig into that just a little bit further, for a lot of leaders, their balances, I think of different leaders I've encountered over my years. There's almost people that they have this genuine care for people, and the minute they get into a position where they're a manager or a leader, they flip, and to where it is all just about pushing, and the care goes away because they lose that balance, or they feel like that's what they're supposed to do. I'm curious, what have you seen as far as different tactics and different, even mindset approaches for those leaders that, get stuck in that push mentality of, I gotta keep pushing it. I gotta keep getting more. And it's usually it's meant to be coming from the right place, but it doesn't come off that way. So I'm just curious, like what have you seen as ways to help kind of prove that you care, rather than just raising expectations?
Well, the first thing is that we believe in getting to the root, not the fruit. And in our coaching, it's why we think it's different, because the fruit is the symptoms, the behavior that's really easy to see. They're pushing, they don't care, they come off as a whatever word would fill in the blank. And I have a lot of empathy for those people because I've been in that situation. And generally, where it's coming from is a place of fear. And those people, even though they're coming off hard, are generally by far their own toughest critic. So we spend a lot of time around what's your little person voice saying? The little person voice is that inner critic inside of us that every healthy human has. It's biologically built inside of us to help keep us alive. We won't break down the neurobiology, but it's just every healthy person I've ever worked with, they have this voice. Unfortunately, most people are ignorant around it. And so they allow that voice to drive. So with that person that you just described, maybe they got elevated into a manager position or a leader position. What might their little person voice be afraid of? What might they be insecure about, do you all think?
I mean, it's the twin thieves, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's failure and judgment. I mean, that's the first thing that comes to my head, right? Not just to pump your book, but that's, to me that, and I guess if I were to say more often than not, I feel like I shouldn't say it. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's judgment, sometimes it's both.
It's both. But what I want to help people see is take a moment to look at what is the root here. You're operating from the place of your little person voice is saying you can never do this. Why? Because a long time ago, when you were 7, 8 years old, you had a teacher who said you could never do it when it got hard. Or you had a dad that was really critical on you and helped to create this little person voice inside of you. A really powerful activity is look at where did your little person voice learn the words that it uses to try and limit you? And then to look at how is it still alive today? Because that leader is just trying not to screw it up. They're just trying not to be exposed because that little person voice says, you're an imposter. You can't do this. So it comes off as tension. It comes off as just a over push. And so what we first want to do is unwire and help them to see that so they can operate from a place of ease a bit more. Does not mean they are soft. It does not mean they don't push, but it comes from a different energy versus being scared of just being exposed. So number one is we have to do that. Get them to a place of energy where they're trusting instead of just trying not to be exposed. And then number two is they got to have a system of caring. Just like your sales system, just like the systems we have in operation, what's your system to capture the heart of the people that you lead? And what we often see is people get really systematic in those other areas and they leave the relationship building up to chance. And they might say, well, I don't need to do it with so-and-so just because, that's Tommy. He's a high performer. He's just always crushing it. He doesn't need me to do that. And over again, we see the people like Tommy get a better offer and leave. And then they go, I didn't know that he needed that type of connection. So what we want to know is what's your proactive connections? We call it rounding of when you're checking in with these key people, how you're building trust with them to do that and to actually show that you're committed to it.
So I'm curious, Lucas, with the little person voice, when I hear you talk about it, I hear imposter syndrome. Are those two the same thing? Are they different? Is imposter syndrome a component of that? But to me, imposter syndrome are those little things that you think of or you hear or you anticipate someone's going to say, when in actuality, most of that's just things you're making up in your own head.
There's a really good quote. I believe it was actually Matthew McConaughey or his dad. All great quotes come from McConaughey, right? That said something like, I've lived through many crises in my life. Most of them never happened. And if you really gather that, how many times do we put a tough conversation that we know we have to have this tough conversation, but we don't have it because our little person voice says things are going to blow up. We're never going to be able to tackle this. And then you have the conversation and you go, well, that wasn't as bad as what I thought it was going to be. If you're like me, it happens, it can happen often. So the imposter syndrome specifically, the idea that you don't have the skills to do what you're going to do, or you're going to be exposed and ultimately judged by other people, is definitely one symptom of that little person voice. And so it's very common. The thing that, and I'll share this story. I have a client who literally his company has an evaluation of over $1 billion. And the first thing on the outside, people would think this guy's crushing it. Like his company's clearly crushing it. He's confident, good looking, like he's got everything together. Within the first 5 minutes of our call, he's talking to me about, do I have the skills to run my company? Like, he's sharing about the imposter syndrome. And what I've seen over and over is it doesn't matter how many world championships our clients have won, how many dollars they've accumulated, businesses they've exited and built. It doesn't mean the imposter syndrome or the twin thieves goes away. And sometimes it can actually elevate it. The difference is how do we learn to handle that and rise above it? Because some people have this fallacy. If I just make enough money, if I just win enough games, then that voice will be gone. And it's a total lie. Instead, we have to do the work to put our arm around that imposter voice, that little person voice. Understand that I tell my clients, if you're not having any of those thoughts, you need to push yourself harder because it means you're way too much inside of your comfort zone. So actually rewire that little person voice is a sign and a signal that you're on track to doing something awesome. So while we don't want it to push us into overwhelm, we've got to follow that voice a lot. When I left teaching to do this full time, my little person voice was extremely loud. How am I going to make enough income for my family? You're leaving a safe job that has insurance. How are you going to do that? But it was exactly what I needed to lean into and go towards. And we try to retrain our clients to be able to handle that voice with less stress, but then also use it as a signal.
So how much of handling that voice is the big person voice, which to me has always been self-talk, is telling yourself you're good enough, is inserting thoughts of affirmations or positivity in kind of talking yourself through the next step. How does one go from that and say, okay, I know what my big person voice is. We've all heard it from time to time, just like we've heard the little person voice. But how do you flip the switch on the big person voice and say, I'm going to turn the volume all the way up so that I drown out the little person as much as possible?
Yeah. The first and most important thing is to understand you're not broken for that little person voice. For many years when I was laying there, I thought I'm supposed to be the leader that everyone thinks I'm supposed to be. Why do I still have this voice? What's wrong with me? And I was in this internal battle trying to stuff out that little person voice. When you try to silence that voice, what tends to happen to it?
Gets louder.
It gets louder. So number one is you have to understand you're not broken for it. The highest performers have this voice, but what you are is you're trained to show up as a high performer in spite of that voice. Okay. So what we do is we help people toggle from that little person voice to the big man more frequently, but then do it themselves. And the second thing I would bring up then is just really a quick story is I always want people to know, who are you in the best version of yourself? Like what is that most attractive character to you that people want to run through a wall for? And then how do you shift gears when you need to show up to be that best version? So for me, one of the moments when my little person voice got the loudest was when my grandfather passed away. So I wrote the book Win in the Dark, and he's the mentor in that book.
Marco?
For a very specific reason. Really special person in my life. He just came up on his death date about six years ago, actually, earlier this week. And it still can bring me to tears because he was that guy that when you were just around him, he had a smile that could ease anybody's burden. And he was that rock for me in a lot of different ways. But he was diagnosed with cancer. And if you've ever seen anybody that had to end up losing a battle with cancer, it's really an unfortunate journey because you see somebody like my grandpa Neil that had so much energy slowly just deteriorate until I'll never forget our last conversation. He was in his recliner where we had so many vibrant conversations back and forth before. And now he was restricted to just kind of laying there. And he was kind of going in and out of consciousness. And at one point when he came to, he asked to speak to me. And so I'll never forget that drive, guys. I was like 5 minutes away. My grandmother said, "Hey, he wants to talk to you," because it had been kind of a long period. So that he was at this state. And so I get in my car and I get there quickly. And he opens his eyes, and we both had this feeling that we knew it was our last conversation together. And he said, "Number one, I want to thank you for all the great times. And I don't want you to forget that I'm always right here with you." And then he asked me if I would do his eulogy. And that was our last conversation. Why do I bring it up is because I'll tell you what, when it comes to my little person voice, I've never been more nervous for a speaking event. I've spoken to crowds of thousands of people. This one, he had probably well over 1,000 people at his funeral. And I didn't know how I was going to be able to deliver to a guy that had such a massive impact on a ton of people. But it taught me a lot about this little person voice, because my little person voice was loud. But what I did was I looked at my ring, and I wear this ring. I'm married to my wife, Katie, and I wear this ring, which was the same ring that my grandma gave my grandfather about 60 years ago. Got passed down to me as the oldest grandchild. And when I look at this ring, it taps in, it helps remind me of the big person voice inside of me already. And I don't care what people's faith background is. I just think that you should have one for tough moments. And for me, I don't teach self-talk all that much. What I teach us to do is listen better, because that little person voice is really loud. That big person voice inside of us, it's already there. My grandfather helped give it to me. My role models, like my dad, my mother, the people that are closest in my life, they've made it part of me. That reminds me I can do hard things. That reminds me you might not know how this is going to turn out, but you're going to be okay. It reminds me of those key things. I just got to listen deeper for it. And so this ring helps as a physical reminder when my little person voice tries to speed up, to slow down. Take that breath. And then to put my focus external, because our little person voice tricks us into only focusing on us. So when I look at my ring, I remember my grandfather reminding me, you can do it. Don't forget that I'm with you. And then I just look out at the people in front of me and figure out, how can I serve them? That's how I go about it. And that's how I train the people that we work with to tap into their big person voice as well.
One of the other things you said, Lucas, when you were talking about kind of caring for the team, and you talked about getting around and finding that, right? Like when you tell that story, right? Like that's a heart story, right? That's a feeling story. What is it a lot of times about leaders that there's so much focus on the now and the production and what we have to get it done yesterday, that I feel like a lot of times that part is missed, right? The inner voice, the leading with the heart, all that sort of stuff. You're curious from your perspective, how do you get somebody to see the long game there, as opposed to the imminency? Especially, you think of all leaders, right? They have their own pressures, right? Whether they're from the outside world or from themselves, but they have those pressures. How do you get them to see the long game of kind of, as you mentioned, making that balance a little bit different?
It's a really good question, especially because people hire us to win more, right? Like, I want to be really clear. They're not hiring us to have a kumbaya session, right? They're not hiring us to do this. And so ultimately, we want them to win more. And I'll give you a very specific story. You just basically described one of my clients when he came to me. He basically was saying, everybody thinks that I'm a jerk. I'll say it that way, but he said a different word. And I'm just trying to keep everybody, help everyone keep their job here. And they don't understand it, right? Like, so that comes up a lot. And here's usually the first part is, one, how's the current strategy working out, right? So like, how is that current strategy on only focusing on today in production? How's that working out for you? And most likely there's a gap. And if we're serious about winning in the long term, and I'm talking about profits, I'm talking about wins and losses, like hard results, most people will say people matter in that people are the ones driving that. So if we're going to win long term, then what does that mean we have to do in our approach, in our disciplined approach, to do the things today that are going to pay us back tomorrow. And that's what really separates, I think, companies that stand the test of time, that stand the test of recessions, is they're doing the work today that is going to prep them for them tomorrow. And what does that look like? Helping people rise above their little person voice, know that they're connected, so that when those tough moments come, you've done the work for it. So we just take a really honest look at, well, what do you care about? Do you only care about results for the next 3 months? Because if that's the case, then yeah, taking the time to pour into your people might not be the best use of your time. But if you care about results in 3 to 5 years, I've never seen a company that doesn't treat their people and respect them to build their skill set, continue to innovate and get better without doing that.
So true. So true. So can you share maybe a story of someone that you've seen that transformation, where they've come in, you kind of mentioned someone in particular, right, where they came in, they changed that headspace. What does that look like a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now?
In regard from that leader or in regard for the company?
Well, maybe both, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, usually what it looks like from the company is I start getting a lot of emails from people saying, thank God. But I remember it, like, I actually love working with these folks because they're truly competitive people. And the reason that we get emails is because they just didn't realize maybe the negative impact that they were having at times. And people will send emails saying thank you because they're transforming. There's a different ease about them. Because again, they're not just pushing and not doing these things because they don't care. Usually it's because they're not handling the pressure and the burden of leadership well. Because leadership can absolutely be lonely. So what does that transformation look like? What we tend to see in our clients is, one, it's a lot of pressure that they're wearing just themselves. So there's a greater sense of ease among that leader. So there's a greater sense of they're sleeping better, they're at home, they're present more. And then at work, what it actually looks like is you say, well, show me your calendar. And they can tell you, hey, I have a weekly leadership meeting, or I have a quarterly offsite. They have a process that's laid out of how I pour into my people. And so they're really confident in talking about their strategy and doing it. And then what we ultimately see in that transformation is they get really good at understanding the better I can learn my people, the further we're going to go as a company. So they can just talk about their leaders more. I'll give you one specific example that comes to mind. A coach we worked with, still do to this day, Division I coach. You know what? I'm actually going to use his name because he wouldn't mind. So Coach Jose Fernandez is at University of South Florida. One of the best coaches, if not the best in my mind, when it comes to women's basketball. Like, a lot of people look at him as the leader, in one of the key leaders inside of that entire group. And about 4 years ago, it's January. And in the basketball season, that's the hard part of the time, right? Like, it's dark, long part of the year. And Jose pushes his team. Man, they push. And they get great results because of it. He recruits well and he pushes well. But one thing that was what I was noticing is his players wanted more connection time with him. And so I challenged him with this. I said, hey, you're pushing, but is there a way we can figure out time for you to spend one-on-one with them? Now, he's got 15 players, one-on-one with them, to pour into their heart, to connect with them, to listen and grow. Now, for someone who's been in the game for many years, he could have easily said, screw you, Lucas, get on the plane, head out of here. Not going to do that. But what he did is he created his notebook. And his notebook is every 2 to 3 weeks, he's sitting down one-on-one with each one of his players and jotting down things that he's learning about them. And they have a conversation where he listens and he cares. So fast forward now, he's been doing that for 4 years. He's more in tune than as many coaches that we work with now, any coach, he's more in tune with them. He hasn't lost that push, but he has a deeper connection from his team as well. So that's a real life example of it.
I love
That's
that.
tremendous.
With the notebook, I would imagine it gives you another tool in the toolbox to be a better leader. But excuse me, as I think about leadership, how many people have, or maybe in your case, need a strategy? Because just like marketing or business or anything, you can be a great leader, but if your team or your company doesn't have a vision, a coalesced vision for where they want to go and how they're going to get there with their people, I feel like you got to have a strategy. Is that fair?
No doubt about it. It's like anything else. We view it as a skill set of you can learn it to be a great leader. You can learn the key factors. We have some science-backed frameworks that we personally use that we know if you score higher in these key areas, we've never seen a leader get worse. Like from an example of a strategy. And unfortunately, a lot of people get elevated as an independent contributor. Maybe they crushed it with sales. And so people are now like, well, they must be a sales leader. And they oftentimes fall short. So one is equipping them with the skill set of how do you move the human heart? How do you have tough conversations? How do you help cast a vision? How do you give that feedback? And then going back to your comment though on the greater ecosystem, it's really helpful that they understand the direction of the company at large too, that they're aligned with that direction overall. Because if there's misalignment, it is hard to lead. I mean, you still can, and there's a lot of people that do a great job. We call it create your nirvana. Like they create their own nirvana on their own team inside of a massive company that maybe isn't going well. But it's hard to do over time if there's not that alignment with strategy on the macro level too.
Yeah, it just seems to me that so many leaders and businesses are not focused on that strategy. But I love the notebook. I think that is something that anyone listening to this podcast today could take away as a tool to help them create that connection and create more care with their team.
Yeah, and if they want, to go further with it, we just say, have the notebook. We call it rounding. What is your cadence for your people that you feel like moves the needle? Make sure that you have the touch points laid out. And then when you sit down with them, it's really about listening at a deep level and figuring out what's been one up for them, what's a win, what's feedback that you can give them that's an up of something they're doing great, and what's a forward for them. What's one thing that they can continue to do better going forward? What do they think is something they could do better doing forward? And if you just have that conversation consistently, that version, we call it fast feedback. A lot of people fall into the trap. They get so busy, they only do a yearly review. They only do a quarterly review. And I like to say, like, what would happen to my son if I told him, hey, Drew, who's 6, we're gonna talk about your behavior once a month. Like the growth wouldn't be good. So we've got to figure out a way to give fast feedback. And that's one tool that we use to make sure that people are taking care of that.
Love it.
Well, one of the things that you've alluded to and said a couple of times, and I think you mentioned the listening to your little person voice, right? Like that to me is something, but a lot of what you've said is really this, how do we lead with listening as opposed to lead with talking? And, a lot of people talk around that with leadership, but, when you talk about leading with the heart and really trying to engage with somebody, it rarely starts with talking. It always, as far as I'm concerned, leads with listening. And if you can really sit down with somebody and just ask a few questions and learn from them and really intently listen, it seems like your impact as a leader can be so much greater.
There's no doubt about that. I can't tell you how many times in our initial kickoff call with someone who's considering coaching, they'll come in and say something along the lines of, I've tried everything and I just don't know where to go from here.
Yeah.
And what I hear from them is they've tried every strategy, but they're missing the boat. Because what I hear, if you really listen, words are the wardrobe to what somebody believes about themselves. And if you listen, people will give you clues of what are they believing about them. Most of the time, what I hear in people talking is they've only gone to that fruit level. They haven't gone to the root level, because I can literally hear their little person voice coming out saying, you're not good enough. I don't have what it takes. What if this fails? But they've never had anybody to help them address it. but it starts with listening.
What about asking questions? Because so often when a leader is faced with someone on their team or a situation, I'm quick, especially as a marketing background, as a creative person, to just go boom, 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 and just give them a whole bunch of stuff, which is, as we know, not a good way to lead. However, I found, yes, you do have to lead by listening, but a lot of times you have to ask the right questions to be able to listen and be able to get the information you need to help that individual. And I think I said this in a conversation this morning, is it almost seems like in circumstances where I've had a really good leader and they've done that, I've almost been able to answer the question without them saying anything else. Like, I knew that. I should have thought of that, right? I'm just curious how often your approach with Jaden Jones is really around asking questions.
So there are some moments, right, where due to time, you just have to be like, here's what needs to happen, go execute. And like,
sure,
we understand that. And there's a place for that. The best leaders that we see, though, that build cultures of ownership, and I want to come back to that word, they master the ability to ask great questions. And why do I say that? Is because if you give a team member something to do, but it's 100% your idea, and though, you just gave them, if they execute that, it's going to produce a lot of results, but it's 100% your idea, I would expect them to execute at about 65, 70% of their intensity. However, if it's their idea 100%, but it's only 80% as good as maybe your solution, but it was their idea, now what happens to the intensity level of what they execute at? It goes way up. And what we've found is when you can get that intensity level up, the ultimate execution is better. So with our teams and our businesses, each year we ask them to look at what are their guiding standards, their shared standards. And we ask them to make sure they have 1 to 3 of them that are really clear. They can be the same as last year. They can be the same as others. But our process is the CEO writes down what they think it should be for this team this year. But then they need to ask the questions that the team helps to come up with what we think. And the best leaders, they can ask questions that ultimately get close to what they want. But if it comes from the leaders or the leadership team themselves, now they have that buy-in. And so just like these podcasts, we've been on many podcasts. The answers are usually only as good as the question is, which is why I appreciate you too. You've done your work. You've really asked some good questions. And so we really believe that in order to get buy-in, great leaders are asking better questions.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, being on a podcast or being a co-host, part of it's just about being a student of the game. And I think the more of these you do, Dustin talks a lot about at-bats. The more at-bats you get, the better you're going to get. But also, it helps doing your research. I mean, one of the reasons I ordered Win in the Dark a couple of weeks ago is because I want to make sure I have this knowledge. And then I hear you talk about your grandfather, aka Marco, from the book, and it all makes sense, right? And I try to ask better questions. I try to be a better leader. And like you say with the Twin Thieves, it's something that it's kind of always going to be there in perpetuity, and you have to continually work to always get better. It's a never-ending game, right?
No doubt about it. And we have a story that we love, if you don't mind me sharing it quickly, that speaks to that directly. And it's about a guy named Kano Jigoro, and he was the founder. Originally, he was in judo. Let me start this over. So I've told this story hundreds of times, but his name's Kano Jigoro, and he originally was in jiu-jitsu, but didn't like it because a lot of his moves weren't legal, right? They weren't okay. So he decides to start his own sport, and he calls it judo. Entrepreneurial, right? He calls this sport judo. As an athlete, he is top at it. Then he goes on to spread it around the world to what it is today, an Olympic sport. And in that sport, they have the different belt levels, right? They have white belt signifies beginner, black belt signifies expert. And as the story goes, he grows, spreads this around the world as a premier sport, but ultimately is on his deathbed, and people that he has trained, close family, are visiting him. And one of his students asked, "Sensei, what do we do? How do we make sure that you die with the honor you deserve?" And he says, "What I want you to do is make sure that you bury me in my white belt. Because wherever I show up after this, I want to make sure I show up with the mindset of a beginner." And why I think that's powerful, because you have the black belt of all black belts asking to be buried in his white belt. And so for us, it's, can you build a black belt skill set in your craft? Whether that craft is selling, whether that craft is marketing, whether that craft is building an insurance company, coaching, build that black belt skill set. The only way you do that is by having a hunger. But then can you keep a white belt mindset? That white belt mindset is what keeps you there, because we've all seen people where they reach a level of success, and that success becomes the exact reason why they don't get the future success that they're hoping for. So to go back to the idea of being a learner every day, we call it having a white belt mentality.
That's so powerful. And a great way to kind of wrap this show up is we talk a lot about mindset. I'm a huge proponent of mindset. And I think that sometimes you have to have the right mentality. And the mentality is, if it's going to be a white belt mindset, changing the way you think, changing your little person voice, those things can all become much easier. So I love that. Before we let you go, Lucas, tell everybody a little bit more about Jadin Jones and the services your company offers.
Thank you for asking. So Jadin Jones is myself and Steve Jones, and we're out there to help. We help build winning teams through leadership. And so that looks like business teams. We offer one-on-one coaching along with private team coaching, where we work longer contracts with groups to go to another level. And then we also do live events, one-off keynotes and workshops to help people have a really powerful experience. And so that's the services we offer. And you can find us by just Googling us or heading to a website.
Now, the one thing I have to do is I have to toot your own horn a little bit, because you and Steve are exceptionally humble, and you probably wouldn't outwardly mention this, but your company has worked with the Green Bay Packers, the Los Angeles Dodgers, and other, Washington State University, I believe, and other very large organizations and professional sports organizations, correct?
Yes, sir.
I think definitely a tribute to the impact you're making, not just locally in Wisconsin, but around the world as well. So thank you for being here. Before I let you go, I forgot one thing. Where can we find you online?
Best way is if they Google Lucas Jadin, my social media things are going to pop up: Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our website is the best way to reach out and get in touch.
In the books, by the way, so having a son who's a high school athlete, I missed Steve in school by about a year, but having a high school athlete who's aspiring to work hard and be a starter, these are two perfect books for anyone with a teenager or anyone who has any desire of playing, I would say, professionally in college or at a high level in high school. There are so many really good life lessons here in both books that I'd recommend you pick them up, because anyone can read one of these books in a matter of just a few days. And it's there are some really good lessons, especially when in the dark. There's a point in the end where it gets a little emotional, and it's got all the feels. So good books to read, very reasonably priced at what, $14.99?
Somewhere in there. Yeah.
Not that it matters.
Changes with Amazon once in a while. So it's usually right in that ballpark.
All right. So I had to make sure I threw an endorsement in there for you. Lucas, thank you for being here.
Really appreciate it. And we firmly believe a lot of people have a book inside of them. And when you go through that process, I think you value books even at a higher level, because Steve and I are both proud of, the work that we've done there, because it's something that we've lived over and over before we decided to write it. And I appreciate you sharing that.
My pleasure. All right, folks, thanks for being here today. We appreciate your ears, the downloads. Until next time, peace.